Our Public Policy Committee is hosting the Influence of Public Safety on the Return to New York City. And joining us today are Karol Mason, who is the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and also Greg David, who is a journalist for the city and former editor of Crain's New York Business. Briefly, in terms of our agenda today, Greg and Karol will give a brief introduction of their roles and background. We'll do a few poll questions and then get into the dialogue around the event. And if you could put your questions as they come up into chat, and then we'll address those at the end. So thanks everyone, and I will turn it over to Greg.
Hello everyone. I'm Greg David. I've been a journalist since 1970. I have 3 jobs these days. I'm director of the Business and Economics Reporting Program at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. And I'm talking to you from my office. I'm virtually the only one here though. I'm director of the Ravitch Fiscal Reporting Program, which brings reporters from around the country for deep dives into fiscal policy. And I cover economics and fiscal policy for the nonprofit news site, The City, after 35 years and 2 months as an editor and contributor to Crain's New York Business. Obviously, the economy has been central to all I've done since I moved to New York. And especially in my book, Modern New York, I spent a lot of time on the issue of crime and its relationship to the economy. Karol?
Good afternoon. My name is Karol Mason, and I am the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is part of the City University of New York system. So you've got 2 CUNY people here with you today, the power of CUNY. Before joining the CUNY 4 years ago, I was the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs at the US Department of Justice. And that's a mouthful, but the important part is I had a $4 billion with a B budget at that point to assist state and local governments with criminal justice issues and victim services, and also oversaw the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the National Institute of Justice. And so these issues have been near and dear to my heart. The last 4 years, John Jay has been the host of what we call our Smart on Crime convening, but we will be moving that this fall to a future public safety convening. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with you all today to encourage you all to keep on the trajectory and support the trajectory that we've been on to improve our criminal justice system and make it more equitable and fair. And we can do that and keep our community safe at the same time. Thank you.
So thank you. Our format today is it's a fireside chat. I'm going to have some comments and ask some questions. I thought I'd begin with the PEG, as we call it in the journalism business, and some of the history. This is a paragraph from the New York Times story over the weekend after the Marine was shot near the Marriott Marquis in Times Square. Nearly 800 people have been shot in the city through June 30th, according to data from the police department, the highest number over the same period since 2002. The increase in gun violence this year has cast a shadow on the city's reopening after 15 months of lockdown. New York's year-long state of emergency was finally lifted last week, and Times Square is once again a bursting cacophony on Saturday night. A full-length Broadway musical is back, etc. I thought I'd do a little history for you. And the history of the decline of crime in New York begins in the year of 1900, 1 year after David Dinkins was elected mayor of the city of New York. And there were 2,200 murders in the city that year. The tabloids asked the key question. The back page, the headline was, "Do something, Dave." And we did something. We raised taxes and began a broad expansion of the police force. The next crucial development came when Rudy Giuliani beat David Dinkins in the 1993 election and made a crucial choice. He was deciding whether to keep Ray Kelly as his police commissioner or to bring in Bill Bratton from Boston. And in a historic decision, he brought in Bill Bratton from Boston. You know, Bratton tells this amazing story in his memoir about being a young cop in Boston. And the precinct where he was assigned had a corner where the kids made noise at night. And every night the cops went out and dispersed the kids, and they came back the next night. And that convinced Bratton that that was the wrong way to do policing. And so what Bratton brought to New York is a theory of policing called broken windows. There are a couple different ways to discuss broken windows. At its fundamental core, broken windows says police have to address all kinds of disturbances to build trust to the community. And the other great addition that Bratton, and especially his guru, Jack Maple, brought to New York was the use of statistics. And the thing they decided was that by cracking down on small crimes, transit, turnstile jumping, for example, they would wind up ensnaring more important criminals. And those strategies began a long series, a long, 2-decade-long decline in crime in New York. What was interesting is that Bratton's successes outlasted his very weak successors. Bratton and Giuliani's egos were too big to share the stage of New York City. When Michael Bloomberg surprisingly won election in 2001, he too had a choice about police commissioner, and he brought Ray Kelly back. And the long decline in crime continued, but at one point, Kelly and Bloomberg decided that to crack down on crime in New York, we had to do something about guns. And their response was stop and frisk, in which enormous numbers of people, virtually all of whom were Black and Hispanic, were stopped and frisked on the street. In retrospect, it was stop and frisk that led to the re-election of, to the election of Bill de Blasio. But the real story here is the stubbornness of Ray Kelly and Michael Bloomberg. They knew stop and frisk had gone too far. And in the last 2 years of the administration, they drastically reduced the number of stop and frisks, but they wouldn't admit it. They wouldn't admit they had made a mistake. What did Bill de Blasio do? Well, to buttress his credentials, he brought Bill Bratton back with a plan to fix what was broken in the Kelly regime. And what Bratton did, or tried to do in fixing it, was to install community policing, to reconnect the cops with their communities. It may have achieved some successes. Crime continued to go down to very low levels. At one point, there were fewer than 300 murders. There were only, I believe there were fewer than 300 murders one year. And in addition to that, the city felt extraordinarily safe, and on a per capita basis was among the very safest cities in the country. Then we get to the pandemic and the social justice movement and the uptick in crime. So that's the context for where we are. So I'd like to turn to Karol now and say, what do you make of the uptick in crime? Is it primarily about shootings and to some extent murders? What should we think about this?
So thank you for the opportunity, but I'd like to first respond to some of the premises of your comments.
All right.
Particularly your last comment, which I heard as equating social justice reform with the uptick in crime.
It was coincident. I'm saying it was coincident.
I know, but I couldn't miss the opportunity to talk about that. And I want to use some facts first. As I mentioned, I led the Bureau of Justice Statistics when I was at the Department of Justice, and understand the power of facts and data that we all ought to be using to guide our conversations and to guide our policy decisions. And I want to just give some context again to what you've said. New York City has experienced extraordinary crime reduction over the last decades, with crime reaching a 6-decade low. So in the 80s and 90s, when a lot of the practices that you mentioned were in place, the city recorded more than 2,000 murders in some years. You mentioned 2,200 in the year for Dinkins' first year as mayor. But according to the NYPD's statistics that I got this week, index crimes, and those are the most violent crimes, index crimes are rape, murder, and robbery. So I want to make sure we have the facts in the context of the narrative that's developing. Index crimes in New York were down slightly 1.7% this year compared to the same period last year. There are a few categories where serious crimes are up, and homicide is one of those. It's up 17.4%. Auto theft is up 25%, and felony assault is up 7.7%. But other crimes have decreased. Robbery, burglary, and grand larceny all declined between 5% and 16% year to year. I think it's important to also, again, put in context where we are. Any homicide is bad, and we do need to focus on what's happening. But I want to, again, make sure that people understand the numbers. There have been an increase in homicides and shootings this year. We had a 64% increase in shootings year to date compared to last year, and a 13.5% increase in murders from 171 to 194. In 2020, the number of murders rose to 462, up 45% from 2019, which was 319. So I think that if you look at the period before the pandemic, crime had continued to decrease. And what our criminal justice data experts will tell us is nobody's really sure what caused the decline. But what we do know is that reducing jail population did not increase crime. It continued to go down even as we enacted reforms. And so for me, what I think we've got to be careful about doing in this time period and looking at what's happening is stay focused on the data and what's actually happening. And what you'll see is that, yes, let there be light.
I'll be right back.
What you will see is that the reforms that have been put in place in many jurisdictions before the pandemic were working. And so there is a lot of, so what we're seeing is that crime is going up, not just in New York City, but other areas. And the common denominator is the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic. There are a group of folks that I deal with regularly as we think about how do we continue to address the inequities in our system and move to more public safety. And I'll get to my project late in a little while. But one of the things that people have pointed out is that during the pandemic, all the systems that were in place that were there to support the reduction in violent crime were shut down because we were shut down. So the violence interrupters weren't out there, the social workers weren't out there, the kids weren't in school, all the social safety networks, people in their household were dying, people were unemployed, housing and insecure. So there are all these factors that lead to that could be part of the uptick. But what I think that we ought to do is look at and examine where it's happening and why. And it's concentrated mainly in poor neighborhoods right now and Black and brown communities. And so I think we've got to be careful with the narrative, but also see the opportunity that we have because of the federal stimulus money to address systemic issues long-term that lead to these issues. And I also think we need to realize that police are not the sole people to deliver public safety. We know that there are a lot of other things that work to improve public safety, investment in mental health, investment in credible messengers and other things. So I see that you want to ask me another question.
Yeah, so we'll pull these apart as we go through. But yes, certainly I agree about the facts, and I'm like to consider myself a data journalist. So I think the numbers are really important, but there's also clear that there's a perception out there and there's a sense of fear. And the New York City Partnership did a survey and found that a sense of unease about the city is one of the major barriers to the return of office workers. And I know it personally. A friend of mine went back to his office at one of the big finance companies this week. And when we got together, his brother, who works in the suburbs, the first question he had for him is, how's the city? And this, I must admit, is someone who actually moved out of the city during the pandemic for many reasons, but a feeling of insecurity was part of it. So talk about the rise of this anxiety, with this fear, whatever it is, and what you think it's based on, and I guess what you think we should do about it.
So I hope you take this with the intended meaning, but I think media and journalists
I was going to ask you that, so that's okay. That's
Yeah,
perfectly fine.
I think that they're at the core of selling what I consider a false narrative about what's really happening. And you know, their job is to sell newspapers, sell news, and fear and bad news sell. Unfortunately, we had this issue when I was back in the Department of Justice. We were always trying to figure out how do we correct the narrative around policing and get people to see the positive aspects of policing when what sells is the negative. And so I think that the challenge is that's why this meeting today is so important, because this is a meeting and a group of important business leaders in New York. And I applaud you for coming to hear this conversation and hear the facts so that we can help break the cycle of this narrative so that people understand the facts and understand that it is safe to come to New York. It is safe to come to work. What we've got to do is invest in areas where there is inequity and factors that lead to an uptick in crime and violence, and focus on those issues and focus on those few people, because the data will show that it's a few people that are responsible for the violence. And so you've got to figure out how to support those people and moving them out of those behaviors. Because I was on a conference yesterday with the National League of Cities with a young adult panel. And what they said to us, we don't wake up in the morning wanting to go shoot somebody. It's circumstances and things that happen that cause us to fall into these places where that is what we do for survival. And so you know, are we providing good education, opportunities for jobs, support for not just the young folks, but their families so they can thrive? And I think that's what's important to break this cycle. I do think that we need to do what the president's talking about, doing tracing guns and getting guns out of the hands of people who don't need them, but that's another discussion.
What should the media do? I mean, what would be the reasonable corrective? Or if you would agree with me that you have to report the Times Square shooting, especially since it was the second one in a month, what should the media say when they do that?
I think that you're right. They have to report what's happening, but I think that it would be nice if they would also ask questions and ask about the data and ask, why is this happening? What's really happening? What does this signify? And report on the answers to those questions. I'm sure that some journalists are doing that.
Some are
asking those questions. But I frankly only watch NBC nightly news because I got tired of local news where it's just murder, 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 murder. And this has been going on for decades. This is not new. And I don't think it represents what's really happening. So I don't have the answer. We've been trying to get journalists, bring them into these conversations, invite them to our convenings so that they see this is what communities are doing. This is what really works. I told Katie and Margot earlier today that I just left a convening that the MacArthur Foundation is hosting today for their Safety and Justice Challenge. And I can't wait for the panel at 5 o'clock. I wish it had happened earlier because they are going to tell us how to combat the false narrative that's developing around crime and its relationship to criminal justice reform. So I think that the challenge is for media folks to do what you're doing, have conversations, get the facts, engage with people and see where things are working and how it's working, and tell that story.
I sometimes wonder whether, in a way, it's a self-correcting problem, because I think one of the issues is that there are just fewer people around. And when you're worried about someone, when you see someone, and for the most part in Times Square, those are homeless people who are populating the street. You know, when you're the only person in the subway car with them, it's one thing. When you're in a subway car with 50 people, it's another thing. And when I talk to people, I feel a lot of sense of anxiety because there's not too many people out there. It's that there are too few people. And if people do come back in the city, I wonder if some of the anxiety will ebb.
Well, I will tell you that I've been riding the subway since April and seeing a steady uptick in the people on the train. And I came back last Thursday night on a train from DC at 10 o'clock at night, caught the A train from Penn Station and felt perfectly safe. And there were lots of people. As a matter of fact, people were so polite, which is the chivalry that I've seen now isn't something I saw pre-pandemic. So I encourage people to, it's like a muscle you haven't used in a while. Come back out, come into the city and see it. Are there things that we wish weren't happening? Absolutely. But I think that people are out and about. I went on a dumpling crawl on Saturday down in Chinatown. It was packed. I was hoping that people still weren't back yet. But I think that those people who have not been spending time in the city, come back in and you'll see that it is really back open again.
So I think we've covered some of the big issues. Why don't you tell us about the project and what can be done to make communities safe and equitable?
So thank you for that opportunity. So my little prop here, I know it was sent out to you all in advance, our future public safety report. So I want to just give you a little background about why the George Floyd killing was so important to me, other than the normal natural thing. When I was the Assistant Attorney General, I funded a project called the Building Community Trust and Justice. I cobbled together money from lots of different sources to address the trust between communities of color in particular and law enforcement. And we had 6 pilot sites, and Minneapolis was one of those pilot sites. I started this work before Michael Brown ever happened, but we launched it after Michael Brown, and the goal was to make sure we never had a Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown situation again. Minneapolis was one of our pilot sites. We spent millions of dollars in years in doing procedural justice, implicit bias, and racial reconciliation work in Minneapolis with every sworn and civilian member of the police department in Minneapolis, and working with the community in racial reconciliation. So when I saw that what happened with George Floyd, I was devastated, because we had used a research base in developing this program, and we got something beyond everybody's comprehension with what happened with George Floyd that day. So the narrative then became police versus, defund the police, reinvest. So I said, let's take the temperature down and have a conversation around what does public safety look like, and how do we achieve public safety, and then talk about what is the role of policing in that. And I thought that as a Black woman president of what was originally a police college, in partnership with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, who at that point was led by a Black woman, I thought, if we can't figure out how to help the country through this conversation, shame on us. So I had a series of 6 curated conversations with law enforcement executives, union people, mayors, public health officials, advocates, a range of people. And I thought that if we could get people focused on what public safety looks like, that would give us a better starting place to help communities through this. And we wound up with 9 points of consensus. I remember one of my colleagues at John Jay, she was afraid of what happens if we don't get any agreement. I said, I'm an eternal optimist. I was confident that we would get consensus, but to come up with 9 points of consensus was beyond my expectations. And so the challenge now is keeping focused on what the work is that needs to get done that leads to public safety, and not letting this narrative about the uptick in murders dissuade us from and distract us from doing what needs to be done. Because what I fear is that we'll return to those practices of the 90s, of that strategy of policing, which does not produce long-term results. And we have an opportunity, again, with the stimulus money coming in, to address these systemic inequities that I think will make us safer communities in the long run.
So give us a rundown of what we should be doing.
So what I think that as the business community, and so I'll focus on what your role can and should be. I think that here in New York City, I've had this conversation with Abney and others. I think the business community can use your voice to push the elected officials, schools, the mayors, police chiefs, everyone to continue to sit down together and look at what's happening and where investments need to be made, and how to be strategic around those investments. Again, I keep going back to the federal stimulus dollars, because what I don't want us to do is just buy a bunch of things and not really address issues. And let me frame it this way. Everybody's been talking about this is the 50th anniversary of Marvin Gaye's What's Going On song. And if you haven't seen the CNN special around it, it's powerful. And you see images from 50 years ago when they didn't have the kind of cameras we have today that look very much like what we see happening in some of our cities today. And what I say to folks is, I'm old enough to remember 50 years ago when that song came out and what the country was like. Some of you are young enough that you'll be here 50 years from now. And I don't want you to be having this same conversation 50 years from now saying, why didn't they get it right in 2021? And so what you can do is challenge folks to come together to have conversations in communities. And New York is not one community. New York City is not even 5 boroughs or not 5 communities. There are multiple communities. And I think that you need to decide where you're going to put your mark down in terms of investing in those communities and investing in making sure people have conversations and bring the right people to the table, especially young people. They need to be in the conversations. If you could have heard the conversation we heard yesterday at the National League of Cities, you would understand why it's so important to have our young people engaged. And they're so good on these issues and they understand it. And so what one of them said to us is, we need young people as translators to help us understand what the issues are and what they think the solutions need to be in addressing these issues. So I would encourage business leaders to look in their backyards and where your investments are in terms of your business investments, and get engaged in those communities, be part of the conversations, to be thinking about what's happening and how do I invest in the success of our communities.
So before this, I was just listening to the mayor and the city council announce with great fanfare their budget decisions, especially on the federal stimulus money. So where should that federal stimulus money go? What are the specifics that would deal with crime and equity?
Well, I think number one, investing in our public K-12 system, and not just buying new computers, but really looking at how are we delivering education and delivering it in a way that the young people are coming out educated and prepared for college, because or technical school or something, because we do know that K-12 is not enough. That they need something beyond that in order to deal with some of the income disparities. I think that they ought to be investing in quality housing. I think they ought to be investing in job training and investing in creating job opportunities, because we saw that during COVID, the communities that were most impacted were those that were already poor. And we need to figure out how do we make sure that we move people out of poverty. And that is a big driver of reducing crime. When people have opportunities to succeed. I would invest in healthcare. I would invest in not just mental health care, but healthcare generally. And I would also encourage the city to look at alternative responses when people are in crisis. I would invest in not just social workers and mental health providers, but by default, police are doing things they don't want to do. They don't want to be the call to get everything that's happening, because that's not what they're equipped to do. And if we can design other systems and the folks who are credible messengers, which are people who have been entangled in our justice system, using them to help break these cycles and pay them like we pay other people's, professionalize it, which we're working on at John Jay with others as well, then I think you break that cycle. And in making those kinds of investments to do that is what we need to be doing.
So I would note that there is an unprecedented expansion excuse me, of money coming into the education system in the city. There's a major expansion of money for mental health, which is part of the effort in the city to replace police officers with others in those situations of mental crisis. But there is much less money than the advocates believe is necessary for job training, especially because some economists I talked to think there could be as many as 200,000 people who will lose their jobs and not be able to get them back, even after the recovery, because of a changing skill nature, et cetera. And I know that many people are upset that we haven't used a lot more than we aren't spending a lot more of the federal stimulus money on that.
Well, I have to say the ready answer is our employer, CUNY. That's what CUNY is designed to do, is move people out of poverty. And we've got 7 community colleges that are well equipped to train people and prepare people for new jobs in the new economy. And we need to be encouraging people to do that.
So I was in a long discussion of that. I did a webinar on all that with people from the workforce, actually for the Harvard Business Club. And James Parrott from the New School said that there should be $1 billion put against such a program. Ken Adams, who runs LaGuardia, which is one of the colleges where they do that, said he'd be happy with $10 million to work on it over the summer. But all agreed that while CUNY has the resources to do that, CUNY has 2 missions. One is the academic mission, and one is the job training mission. And it's hard to get the job training mission the spotlight and the momentum that it deserves. Tell us more to what are the next steps for your group, and especially, and then what are the next steps in addition to sort of getting involved in conversations that the people on this call could take?
So what we're doing, again, you know, I like to say this problem is big enough that it needs all of us in the solution. John Jay doesn't own this solution. So I've been working with Vera Institute, Center for Court Innovation, the Public Welfare Foundation, Education Trust, some public health groups. We're pulling together a convening that we hope to have the end of October, 1st of November, where we're going to continue the work that we've done in the past on our Smart on Crime convening, but and bring it further out from just the criminal justice perspective to look at best practices and make sure that people understand this is what is working in communities, and this is what you should be doing. You know, as I mentioned, the MacArthur Foundation has their Safety and Justice Challenge that's working in communities and doing a great job. The Obama Foundation has done a mayor's pledge about reimagining policing, and the next step is thinking about reimagining public safety. So the next steps for us are, again, showing people how do you, multiple things, how do you have the conversations in your communities to build out a plan, because I do think that people need to be engaged, as you talked about, budget allocation, in how do these resources get allocated in a way that addresses these long-term issues. But we're going to be bringing in advocates to help them understand this is how you engage in that conversation. This is where the levers of change are, but also talking to elected officials about how to help them engage community members and young people in the conversation as well. So that's the first step. The next step, as a police college, I'm also interested in pulling together some educational resources for police departments to get them thinking differently about their role and how to rebuild that trust with the communities. I recommend listening to Attorney General Keith Ellison's remarks after the sentencing last week. And he talked about you can't have public safety without community trust, because police can't solve crimes without the engagement of people, witnesses in the community. And if they don't have that trust, they're not going to cooperate. So one of the things that I want to do is build out programs to bring to police departments, adding on what we did during the national initiative to build community trust, but do it through a race lens. And every community is different. So understanding that what's happened in Minneapolis is different than what's going to happen in New York City, than what happens in Atlanta, and helping, again, have police understand why community members don't trust them, what the history is, so that they understand that as they're interacting with their community. So that was a whole lot in a short answer.
So this would be a good time for people to put questions in the chat, because I have one more question to ask. And while chaos has, for the moment, taken over the mayor's race, it would seem that the mayor's race did speak directly to this issue of how people thought about crime, because it was crime, most people I talked to think, or the fear of crime, that propelled Eric Adams' candidacy to the #1 position at the end of the first round of voting. What did you take away from the mayor's race about crime and the attitudes of people in the city?
So it was interesting. I've just been reading the newspapers. I wasn't involved in the campaign, and I actually don't vote in New York. Um, um, so I could be just a neutral observer of what was happening. And what I found interesting is watching the narrative of what was important change as the, in the beginning, it was about reopening and how are we going to come back. And then as we reopened, the narrative became about crime. I don't, what I worry about again is a narrative taking hold that I don't think is fair to the work that many of us have done to make the system more equitable and fair while keeping communities safe. So what it tells me is that the city is I can't think of a better word, all over the place, because when you look at the vote, the top three have very different approaches to what the city needs. So I don't think the city, rightfully so, is unanimous about what the problem is and what needs to happen next. And I think that's right. I think there are many things that are needed. I think that they're a focus on trying to figure out why we have this uptick in crime and public safety. This question about how do we support the economic vitality and return of the city, as well as having a well-functioning city. It would be interesting to have all three of them rolled into one person as the next mayor.
What do you have any recommendations? What should the next there is going to be a new police commissioner. What qualities do we want in the next police commissioner?
So I think the NYPD leadership understands these issues. And I think that what I'd like to see is a leader who understands the importance of the relationship to the community in figuring out public safety. I think if somebody comes in and repeats some of the behaviors from the 90s, it's going to set us back on multiple fronts. And so I'd like a new, whoever comes in to lead the mayor's office as well as the police department to understand the importance of relationships and communication across all constituencies, and a commitment to engaging in conversation and not just thinking they have the answers to solving crime. So I think it's somebody with good interpersonal and listening skills will be critical.
I have only one question in the chat so far. I hope there'll be some more. But the one question is, do we know, I mean, you did say that many of the shootings and murders are in poor communities of color. Do we know more about the breakdown so far? Or is that what we need to find out about?
So all I know is that the crime numbers are not evenly distributed through New York City communities. They tend to be concentrated in lower income and Black and brown communities that are experiencing the brunt of this harm. That's the most detail I have right now. Obviously, people can dig in and get the answer to those questions, but I didn't come with the answer to that question.
So there was a question in there for me, and that is the pros and cons of converting hotels into temporary housing and shelters, and the business, specifically the business community that surrounds those shelters. Well, when the reason for doing this, of course, is that in the area of, as the COVID epidemic took place, you couldn't have congregate shelters without turning them into the same disaster we saw at the nursing homes, and our hotels were empty. And so there was plenty of room in the hotels to house people basically in single rooms or families in a room. And the mayor has now adopted a policy that just accelerated in the last 2 days to return those people to the shelters. I don't think there's any doubt that in some key areas, the neighbors got upset. Whether it had any specific economic impact is hard to say. Oh, my lights went off again. I'll do that in a second.
At least we know you're being energy efficient.
Yes. Well, CUNY saves every dime it can, right? So we don't know what economic impact it has, but it is a problem that is going to end because they are going to empty the hotels. I'm actually going to be very interested to see what the economic impact is on the hotels. You might read a statistic which says that New York hotels are back to about 65% occupancy, but there's a major asterisk that most people don't explain. And that is that 65% of the hotels that are open. If you go back to the number of rooms that were available pre-pandemic, the number is still something like 35%. So that is definitely an issue. A question for Karol: while there's a lot of change that needs to happen in order to see improvement on many fronts, what action would Karol specifically recommend the city of New York take first in the chain of change?
The first step I would take again is has already started. And I do want New Yorkers to recognize that NYPD has been engaging with communities and talking with communities about how to better serve the communities. I think that the first step again is to be engaged in conversations with the elected officials about how this federal stimulus money is going to be spent. You all have an outsized voice in helping to shape what happens next, because people care about what happens from a business perspective in New York, because we're all dependent on its success. I think that you all need to, weigh in, use your voice and say, ask questions, show up at the meetings and say, how are you addressing systemic issues? What's your plan? So that they know that you're watching and that you care and that you're engaged in these discussions. So that's to me the first step, is making sure that we don't squander this opportunity with the resources to address the problems that were laid bare because of COVID and the George Floyd situation.
So no more questions so far. Karol, do you
Actually, there's one more in
what?
there.
This one?
Yeah, there's some there's some police departments across the country. So I will say, I moderated a panel for the National League of Cities a few weeks ago, where Newark talked about how it's created basically an Office of Violence Reduction and funded it on par with how it funds policing. And I believe they had no shootings during 2020. It was some fabulous statistic like that. And I thought, wow, how did you do that? Well, I know how they did it. So there are cities, and DC is doing some, again, innovative things with creating, when you create an Office of Violence Reduction and you fund it and treat it like an important long-term part of the city, often what happens is these programs are treated as programs, and they get funded. When there's an economic crisis, they're defunded. And that's a mistake, because to keep on this trajectory, it takes long-term sustained work, permanent work. So yes, there are cities where that is happening successfully. I know that in Louisville, they're beginning to do more work in this area. There are lots of models of success. If you go to our report, we reference some of those places where some good work is happening. But I also suggest that you go to the MacArthur site, the Safety and Justice Challenge. Those cities that are participating in that challenge are really doing good work and succeeding. So there are lots of models across the country where people are doing this work and investing in this work, and it does produce results. And nobody asked this, but I do want to say this, because there's this narrative out there that bail reform is part of the reason for the uptick in crime. And I just want to talk about a recent study of 12 jurisdictions that implemented significant pretrial reforms, found that each experienced subsequent decreases or negligible increases in crime after implementation. And our neighbor, New Jersey, eliminated virtual cash bail in 2017, reduced its pretrial justice jail population by 45%, and did not experience a corresponding increase in crime generally, or from people released pre-trial. So these are experiences pre-COVID. So that's why I think we can say that a lot of what's happening is COVID related, and we've got to examine what resources and programs were impacted by COVID that are now showing themselves up in increased crime numbers. And we are convinced, those of us in this work, that when those resources get back out there, that the numbers will come back down, but they've got to get those folks back out there, the credible messengers back out there. And what I would say is that it is happening in communities, happening well, but you've got to be careful of who you bring in to do this work to make sure they've got a track record. There's a lot of data and research about the success of these programs. New York is using the two big models that people talk about. One is Ceasefire, which is run out of John Jay, and the other is Cure Violence, which is Gary Slutkin's model. They both work in terms of focusing on the small number of people who are really the ones causing the violence and breaking that cycle. Oakland has done some great work, and there are programs where it's important to invest in the people doing the work and pay them as real city employees that are part of your public safety network.
So I'd just like to end by putting
We actually have a poll.
Oh, we have a poll. Go ahead.
If you don't mind. And we had one other question come through, so we'll hold that for after the poll. But people who are responding to this may have changed their opinion from the beginning of this talk to the latter half. So if you could take a moment and just fill this out, and then we'll share the results. Okay, so first question, is public safety a concern in regard to your personal return to work in New York City? So definitely some people from the audience are still, I would say, hesitant, but perhaps as we learn more about the programs and the sort of activity and volume of people come back to the streets, that will change. Second question is, do you feel that the transit hubs and mass transportation are currently safe for your employees and or the return to office this fall? So again, some concerns there. And then the last one is your company addressing any public safety concerns as part of their return to work plan? It looks like most companies are not. So Greg and Carol, do you want to add to some of the results that we received from the poll?
So here's my context for this. The worst economic downturn in New York City occurred from 1969 to 1977. We lost 620,000 jobs, 400,000 of them in one sector, manufacturing. While there was a really tough recession, 87 to 93, every downturn after that was shorter and less severe until we got to March of 2020, in which the city in a short period of 2 months lost about 900,000 jobs. We had a record 4.6 million jobs. We lost 900,000 of them. And again, one sector bore the biggest brunt of that, and it was leisure and hospitality. Where are we today? We are still 510,000 jobs short of our pre-pandemic peak. Only San Francisco and Los Angeles have done worse in regaining jobs. And New York City's economy will not return to anything like its pre-pandemic levels unless two things happen. Unless the office workers come back, unless the tourist comes back. And that's where this connection exists. And that's what your poll just showed. It is the return of office workers and tourists that is the only way New York City can recover. And indeed, what we don't know is we don't know about these structural changes, especially in office work. If only 60% of the people are back in Labor Day and they're only working 3 days a week, that's going to make difference. I was talking to Jeff Garrell about his buildings in Soho, one of the hardest hit retail areas in the city. And he just said unprompted, I'm going to have to cut the rent for those people who are providing breakfast and lunch because they're not going to have as many customers. So that's where the future of New York lies in an economic sense. And that's how this issue plays into it.
And I would hope that this conversation gives you a little more comfort about what the reality is, to change the narrative when you have conversations with your employees about what the facts are about how safe the city is. And I would encourage you all yourselves to come in and experience it personally so that you can say with confidence to your employees, it is safe. Excuse me. I've been here, I'm using the subway, I'm using mass transit, and it is safe. I am comfortable because I think that and that's what I'm trying to do with our workforce, is letting people know that you've got to give people space to do that. Again, as I said, it's like using a muscle you haven't used in a long time. And their anxiety is deeper than just the public safety issue. I think that some people use the public safety uncertainty as a hook to anchor their other anxieties, but it's deeper than that. But if you come out of the bubble and experience it, I think that people will see it's wonderful to be back out and engaged in the city, and the city is a place we want to be. I will pass on the conversations that we've had today to my contacts at the NYPD so that we can be thinking about how do we communicate to the business community that it is safe to come out. And I think that the public service campaigns that they've been running on TV, particularly New York One, are really good in terms of getting people excited about coming back. They've used them in the context of the virus and the vaccine. And I think the city needs to engage in that same kind of public awareness campaign to get people comfortable coming back into the city again.
And I would just note for one final point for the question that was just placed, the bids have been playing a major role in keeping the neighborhoods, keeping the business districts in good shape. I'm going to do a story about Soho, and the bid there played a huge role in getting that neighborhood through the pandemic. But the bids are not the solution in a way. The bid couldn't do anything to prevent the fact that 1/3 of the stores in Soho are vacant, and they're vacant because the tourists aren't here.
Well, thank you both. Unless you have any other comments, I think this has been a very engaging dialogue, very informative. We've all learned a lot about what the facts are, and to do our duty in spreading the word that the city is safe and come back. And speaking on behalf of us, the audience being in the commercial real estate sector, we need the people back. And I think Karol and Greg, you explained all of the points and things that we can sort of focus on and lead forward with very well. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the audience. And we'll see you at the next CoreNet event. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Enjoy the holiday weekend.
Thank you. Have a wonderful holiday. Fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Have a happy